So I'm Alex, and this is my epoxy river table. I created this table for my brother because when I was visiting him during his internship in Colorado, I noticed him admiring some of these tables that were all, of course, extremely expensive. So I thought, why not make him one by myself and then give it to him as a Christmas present? So here it is. So with this table, first thing I had to do is I had to find some wood with live edges in it. Not sure how well you can see those, but these edges here would normally have bark on them. I had to take the bark off so that it could actually seal properly. But it doesn't have like a cut square edge. So it looks more like a river on the inside because you do have the natural curvature of the wood instead of some mechanical, like just block. So I wanted to have that, so I had to go online and figure out who sold wood with live edges. And I managed to find some, and I'll probably have a picture of that later. But I got it, and then I had to strip the bark off the edges, and I decided I wanted to cut the piece of wood in half. So these normally would have been like a single piece of wood that I just chopped here so that I could make it two pieces of wood and have the river in between them. Then I had to go find an epoxy. And there's different kinds of epoxy that are rated for different thicknesses. So this top coat, this is a special tabletop epoxy. It's food safe, assuming you don't put anything weird underneath it. But it can't go more than, I think in the instructions it says maybe half an inch thick or 3/4 of an inch thick. I don't quite remember. But it can only be like that thick. And this is clearly not like just this thick. So I had to find another epoxy that I could put underneath that could be poured in a thicker layer and still have structural integrity. So I had to get a special kind of pouring epoxy that would be strong enough to hold up and into which I could put this dye, which is actually a powder-based dye, so that I could get the river color from it. Once I had poured this guy first, so you have to seal the wood first so that it doesn't bubble up. If you don't seal the wood before you put your full pour of epoxy in, it might work, or it might not. I did an experiment in which it did not work, and the wood instead absorbed all of the epoxy into itself, pretty much. So I had a very, very strong piece of wood, but very little epoxy left, so it didn't look quite the way I expected it to. So with these, what I did is I sealed them with the tabletop epoxy that I had, so that I could get all the bubbles out, could prevent the wood from absorbing any more epoxy. And I did the same thing with the rocks inside of here. And then I placed them all into a mold. So after I sealed these pieces of wood with a tabletop epoxy, and I did the same thing with the rocks, I had to create a form for them. So I created that form out of melamine, which would allow me to release the wood fairly easily without having it stick too much. Okay, so for the form of this, the melamine that I had to use, I had to create 4 different pieces of it, so that, well, you'd have one for each side, essentially. And there was also a form release that I had to put into the mold, so that when I went to take the mold out, it wouldn't stick to the melamine, because with that same previous pour that I tried out, it stuck to the melamine, and I had to cut a lot of my epoxy off. Which, of course, is not something I want to do, given that epoxy costs a decent amount of money. So while I was creating that form, I had my 4 different pieces that were screwed in, and then also caulked in. And I caulked to all of the edges on that melamine to create a solid form that wouldn't allow any of the epoxy to seep through. Because if all your epoxy seeps out, then you're not really making anything. So once I created the form to be a little bit bigger than the size of this, so that I could have some wiggle room while trying to get the table out of the mold, I started pouring. So I did my first pour of this blue color that you can see at the very bottom here, like the river. And so I placed the rocks throughout it, and then I did my little river pour. And it worked out really well. So then I went to do my next pour, which was just going to be a clear layer over top of it with the leaves on top of the rocks. That one, at first, wasn't going to work out super well, so I had to stop in the middle of my pour because I found out that the blue epoxy hadn't actually sealed as much as I thought it had. So the new clear epoxy was starting to go underneath it. So I had to stop, and I had to wait for another several days, really, for it to harden enough that I can then do a pour on top of it. So I finally got to do my final pour of the normal epoxy, so this inside epoxy here, and I got it to be pretty thick, and then all I had to do after that was just put on a layer of the tabletop epoxy. Now, for every different time you put on epoxy, depending on the thickness, it can take 72 hours or more to cure fully. So this was really just a waiting game of trying to figure out when I could pour my next layer of epoxy. Once I'd finally poured the very last layer, which was this tabletop epoxy on top that makes it nice and food safe and unlikely to discolor or anything, I started working on the legs with that same tabletop epoxy on it. So these legs were just wooden legs that I wanted to seal so they would kind of match the color and shine of the tabletop without necessarily being too distracting. So I just sealed them with the same thing and tried to get all the bubbles I could out of them as well. Bubbles in epoxy are nightmares, and you have to use like a torch to try to get rid of all of them while you're waiting for the epoxy to set. And then when I went to release it, what I did is I took a hammer and I hit it until it came off. After unscrewing it, of course, because otherwise that would never have come off. So to further release the mold, I used a putty knife and I kind of shoved it underneath the mold through the caulking, and I just, also hit it with a hammer. Everything can be solved by hitting it with a hammer, pretty much, is what I've learned today. And so I took this putty knife and I would hold it right here and I would hit it with a hammer just to get all the edges loose even further, so I wouldn't have to hit it with a hammer too many times. Because if you just break the thing without getting it slightly loose, it's not great, really. It's still going to stick a little bit to your table, or it's going to just crack in half, or the wrong part of it's going to crack off. It's not good. So I tried to loosen up the entire bottom before I tried to hit it too much with a hammer on the top. Still had to hit a little bit, though, because, hammers. That's the all-around multi-tool. So you might be wondering why my beautiful table, that is so shiny on top, is not as shiny on these edges. Weird, right? So that's because when I built in that extra space into my mold, I built that in so that I could cut off these edges, since some of the caulk still tends to stick to the bottom or insides of the mold. So I want to be able to cut that off of the epoxy without having to worry about it too much. So I took this outside and just basically used a table saw on it. So I ran it through the table saw after trying to figure out where the edges were, and cut off each of the sides just to get rid of all of that extra gook is really the best word for it, that was attached to my table. And then I sanded it down a little bit on the sides here, just to make sure that my brother doesn't get splinters off it or anything else bad like that. But I've learned that unless you get an extremely high grit, you cannot get this back to the shine that it was at. I used, I think it was a 10,000 grit sandpaper, and it still did not get it as shiny as I needed it to be. So when you cut epoxy, and this is a PSA for anyone who ever has to cut epoxy, it creates a lot of kind of dust. It's like sawdust, but made of epoxy, and so it sticks to everything, everywhere. The entire inside of the table saw was coated in epoxy bits that took a very, very long time to pull out, because it's just a little tiny shard of a very sticky, plasticky type thing that is just everywhere. So I had to blow the table off. So I had to blow this table off with a big air blower. I had to pick everything out of the table saw. I had to do a whole bunch of work even after I cut this, just to get all of the additional epoxy off of everything, because it gets everywhere. Once all of these had set, though, it was just trying to screw in the legs, and the table was done. Okay, thank you everyone so much for watching, and I hope this has inspired you to make your own epoxy river pour table.